For almost a decade, if you were a NASA astronaut and you wanted to get to the International Space Station, you had to hitch a ride on a Russian rocket. Yeah, seriously. But that all changed. Today, we're going to dive into the absolutely groundbreaking program that brought human spaceflight back to American soil and, well, completely changed the game for how we get to orbit.
All right, so here's what we're going to cover. We'll start with why there was a gap in U.S. spaceflight in the first place. Then we'll get into NASA's solution, the Commercial Crew Program. We'll meet the two companies they picked and compare their spaceships, the Dragon and the Starliner. After that, we'll walk through what a typical mission to the ISS looks like and wrap up with why this whole thing is so important for unlocking the rest of the solar system.
Okay, so to really get why this program is such a massive deal, we got to rewind a little bit, back to the end of a truly legendary era, the retirement of the space shuttle. So, picture this. It's 2011. The iconic space shuttle program has just ended, and all of a sudden, the United States, the country that put people on the moon, right, has this huge, glaring problem. How in the world do you get your own astronauts to the multi-billion-dollar space station that you helped build? And for nine long years, there was no way for the U.S. to launch its own astronauts from its own soil. The launch pads at Kennedy Space Center, the ones that sent Apollo to the moon and all those shuttles to orbit, they just went silent. It was a massive, critical gap in America's ability to get people into space. The only option? The only ride to the International Space Station, the ISS, was to buy a seat on a Russian Soyuz rocket. That meant every single American astronaut launched from Kazakhstan in a Russian capsule. And, from a strategic standpoint, relying completely on another country, well, that's just not a long-term solution. America absolutely needed its own ride back to space. So what was the answer? You might think, well, just build another NASA-owned spaceship. But nope. NASA decided to try something completely different. Something pretty radical, actually. They essentially created a taxi service to orbit. And this was a huge shift in how NASA does things. For its entire history, NASA designed, built, and operated its own spacecraft. Think Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, the shuttle. But with the Commercial Crew Program, NASA basically becomes a customer. They're not the owner-operator anymore. They set the super strict safety requirements, but then they pay a company a fixed price for the trip. It's up to the private companies to figure out the best way to build the hardware. So this program, it represents a whole new way of thinking about getting to low Earth orbit, that patch of space right above our heads. The idea was to create a real commercial market where NASA is just one customer, maybe the biggest one, but not the only one. The goal was to get safe, reliable, and, this is key, cost-effective access to space for everyone.
And look, this didn't happen overnight. It was a long process. It all kicked off around 2011 when NASA started funding a bunch of different company concepts. A year later, they narrowed the field down to three main players: Boeing, Sierra Nevada, and SpaceX. Then, in 2014, the big decision came. NASA awarded the final contracts to just two companies to actually build and fly the vehicles. And then, finally, in 2020, that's when the first astronauts launched from American soil since the shuttle retired, ending that 9-year gap. So who were the two companies that actually won these massive contracts to be NASA space taxis? Well, it's a super interesting story, kind of like a tale of two very, very different competitors. Okay, in one corner you have Boeing. These guys are an absolute titan of the aerospace world, with over a century of history and deep, deep roots in America's space program. And in the other corner, you've got SpaceX, the total newcomer, the trailblazer, founded in 2002 with this unbelievably bold mission of making humanity a multiplanetary species. It's the classic old guard versus the disruptive new kid on the block. Now, what's really, really important here is that NASA intentionally chose two companies. Why? Redundancy. It's a huge deal. If for some reason one company's spacecraft has an issue and is grounded, the other one can still fly. This ensures that the U.S. always has a way to get to the International Space Station, no matter what. No more relying on a single ride. All right, let's geek out a little bit and look at the actual hardware, because the two companies took totally different approaches when it came to designing their spaceships. And this image just says it all, doesn't it? You can really see the two different design philosophies right here. On the left, you've got SpaceX's sleek, modern-looking Falcon 9 with the Crew Dragon on top. And on the right, you've got Boeing's Starliner capsule sitting on the absolute workhorse of a rocket, the Atlas V. Two totally unique systems, but both heading to the exact same destination. This chart really breaks down the biggest differences. So you can see the crew capacity is pretty much the same for NASA missions, but the tech, that's where things get really different. SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket, its first stage is reusable. It's designed to literally fly back and land itself after launch, which is incredible. And then when the capsule comes home, it splashes down in the ocean. Boeing's Starliner, on the other hand, is designed to land on solid ground, using these big airbags to cushion the touchdown. So let's take a closer look at the SpaceX system. That Falcon 9 rocket is powered by 9 of their Merlin engines. The Crew Dragon capsule is perched right on top, and it has its own little thrusters, called Draco thrusters, for moving around in orbit. It also has this super powerful launch abort system that can basically rocket the crew to safety at any point if something goes wrong during the launch. Okay, now let's flip over to Boeing's stack. The Starliner capsule gets a ride on an Atlas V rocket, and this vehicle has a long, incredibly reliable flight history. It's a proven machine. Boeing's whole approach is really built on this legacy of reliable, flight-proven components, from the engines to the upper stage, but they've obviously adapted it with new systems specifically for flying crew. So, we've seen the rockets, we've seen the capsules, but what does an actual mission feel like? Let's do a quick fly-through of the whole journey, from the launch pad in Florida, all the way up to the space station, and then back home again. And it all starts right here, at Cape Canaveral in Florida. I mean, after years of those pads being quiet, seeing this, it's just amazing. Human spaceflight is back at the Cape, with both companies launching their crews into orbit on their way to the ISS. Okay, so after a few months up on the station, how does a SpaceX crew get home? Well, it all starts with an automated undocking from the ISS. Then the capsule fires its thrusters to start falling back to Earth. It survives this insane fiery re-entry through the atmosphere, and then a whole sequence of parachutes pop out to slow it down for a nice, gentle splashdown in either the Atlantic or the Gulf of Mexico, where a recovery ship is already waiting to pick them up. Now, Boeing's return trip. Totally different. After re-entry, the whole parachute sequence kicks off when they jettison the forward heat shield. But the really unique part, the final step, is the inflation of these 6 massive airbags. They pop out right before touchdown and cushion the capsule for a soft landing on solid ground, out in the American West. No ocean required. So, okay, we have 2 brand new, independent ways to get to the International Space Station. That's awesome. But the real impact, the real reason this program is such a game changer, it goes way beyond just getting to low Earth orbit. This quote from NASA just nails it. It perfectly captures the grand strategy here. Basically, by handing off the routine commute to orbit to private companies, NASA can free up its own incredible resources, its budget, its brain power, and point them toward a much, much bigger target. And what does that mean? It means NASA can now focus on the really hard stuff, the monumental tasks of deep space exploration. We're talking about returning humans to the moon with the Artemis program. We're talking about landing the first woman and the first person of color on the lunar surface. And it's all about preparing for that next giant leap, sending the first human crews to Mars. This isn't just about one program. It's about building a whole economy in space. So the Commercial Crew program didn't just break America's reliance on Russia for a ride to space. No way. It kicked off a whole new era of commercial spaceflight. Low Earth orbit is officially open for business. The taxi service is up and running. So the big question now is, where are all these new commercial rockets going to take us next?